Thea Sorrell kept the bees on a rented lot at the edge of the valley town and worked the white hives alone in a veil no other soul there would put on, and the respectable side of the little town had decided she was something unnatural for it, when the truth was that she was a widow doing the one honest thing left to her. She did not know yet that before the orchards came to bloom a near-silent man who grafted fruit trees for his bread, a man she had given a jar of honey and scarcely spoken to, would put his own name beside hers against the whole town and change the entire shape of her life. It had begun the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her husband, Daniel Sorrell, had been the bee-man and orchardman both, a gentle, careful fellow who loved the hives the way some men love a fiddle, and through 4 summers he had taught her the colonies frame by frame until she could read a hive by its hum the way some women read a face. Then a pleurisy settled in Daniel's chest one wet winter and would not leave. And one cold gray morning he was simply gone, and Thea stood at the silent hives in the frost as though the world had not ended. She buried him on the rise above the bee lot, and because she could work the colonies as well as any man the valley had known, she went on keeping them and rendering the comb and selling the honey and wax, the one trade her hands knew, in a town that had no other place for her. And the respectable side of the town, the side with the painted storefronts and the church and the merchant's wife at the head of it, looked at a young widow going veiled among stinging things no decent person would touch, talking low to the hives and working wax by lamplight, and decided by supper of her first week alone exactly what that made her. The word went round the way the worst words always do, quiet and certain and impossible to answer, that it was not natural, a woman the bees would not sting, a woman who charmed the creatures and kept company with them in the dark, and Thea Sorrell, who had done nothing she was ashamed of, became a thing the decent wives lowered their voices about and drew their skirts past on the boardwalk. Here is the thing the town had not troubled to learn about the woman it had so much to say about. Thea was not a soft girl who had drifted into a strange trade by accident. She was 26, raised on a hard hill farm by a mother who had no sons and so taught her to do whatever the place wanted doing, and she had never been any good at being decorative. She had the one thing of Daniel's worth keeping, his old brass bee smoker with its little leather bellows and domed lid. The smoker he had courted her with by puffing cool smoke over the combs and showing her the bees would not rise to it, and she kept it bright and used it every day. The soft breath of it across the frames, the low, contented note the colony gave back when the smoke calmed them, was the one thing in that whole hard, lonely spring that still felt like Daniel and like home. And none of it would matter, because the frost meant to finish what the gossip had started. A killing frost had come down the valley late after the buds had swelled, and had blackened the bloom on every tree and burned the wildflowers off the hills before the bees could work them. And bees with no bloom to gather are bees that starve. The honey flow that should have filled the supers never came. The colonies ate down the last of their winter stores and began to fail, hive by hive, the hum thinning toward silence. And Thea understood, listening to the wind worry the honey shed door, that when the merchant who held her lease decided the lot was as good as dead, the first person he would put off the ground was the lone woman keeping it. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck or by a fortune dropping out of a clear sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever heart spring you have been handed, and if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Thea is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person plain when the whole town has already decided not to. The silent soul who would see her plain was an itinerant orchard man named Jonah Reed, the closest-mouthed fellow ever to come down that road. He went farm to farm grafting good fruit stock onto wild rootstock and pruning the old neglected trees, slow, patient work that wanted a man who could stand a whole day alone up a ladder with a knife and not mind it. He had come west years before with a wife and lost her to the same hard country their first winter, and had not married again, nor wished to, and had got so far out of the habit of company that the people he worked for took his silence for sourness, the way people do. But Jonah Reed had eyes, and what they had been telling him since he rode in for the spring grafting was that the bee woman the town had decided to scorn carried herself with more plain dignity than any of the women who scorned her. He saw her work the hives from dawn to dark and walk to the store through talk that would have bowed a weaker back, and never once let the town see her flinch. As though their contempt were a kind of weather she had decided not to feel. And he understood, the way a quiet man understands everything, two things the valley would not say aloud, that the merchant did not mean to fight the frost but to use it, to call the lot dead and clear the lone widow off the ground he had long wanted, and that without her bees to carry the bloom from tree to tree. When it came back, not one orchard in that whole valley would ever set its fruit. If you've made it this far into Thea's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was a hungry evening late in that frost-killed spring when the thing came to a head. The merchant came out himself. A man named Orrin Vesper, who wore a clean town coat at a yard full of dust, and told her, with the gate open and whoever cared to hear it, that the lot was leased for a working apiary, and a yard full of dying hives was no working apiary, and the town meant to call the lease void and clear the ground at the quarter day. A man with a real living off it might have been carried a while, he said. But the town would not hold a lot for a lone woman to keep a few starving bees on. He was sorry. He was the kind of man who is always sorry. And Thea stood at the edge of the bee yard that was the last of the life she and Daniel had built, the brass smoker gone cold in her hand. And she did not beg, because she had learned from a hard mother that begging only feeds the kind of man who comes to watch you do it. But she felt the cold go all the way through her, because she had nowhere to go. Jonah Reed was there. He had come up at the end of the day to ask after the bees he needed for his grafts, and he stood off by the fence in the dusk and heard the whole of it, and something in his quiet face had gone very still and very hard. He said nothing while Vesper talked. He waited until the merchant had tipped his clean hat and gone back toward his lamps in town. And then he came to the gate and took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands, and said to Thea Sorrell the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He said he knew it was not his place, but he had heard what they meant to do, and it was not right. A thing she had not done. Being a woman and being alone. Costing her the lot and the name she had kept clean through all of it. And then he said there was one way to stop them, if she could stand the idea. The town would clear a leased lot off a lone woman and call it nothing. But it could not so easily put a married couple working a trade off a lease, and the talk that called her unnatural had nothing left to say about a married woman keeping bees in her own yard. If she would let him marry her on paper, plain and quiet before the quarter day, the merchant's whole easy reason came apart in his hands. He would take a cot in the lean-to by the honey shed and ask nothing of her she did not freely give. She would keep her hives and her trade and her own self entire. And the bees, he said low, almost to himself, would carry the bloom for the trees when it came back, and that was worth more to this valley than the merchant's ground ever was. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat and not to her face, because he could not have made it any other way. Thea did not answer that night. She lay awake in the little house with the wind worrying the eaves and turned it over. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and her own livelihood handed back to her, the very things the town and the merchant had set out to take, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, without the pity that was worse than the whispering, as a plain matter of justice and not of charity. In the gray morning she went out and breathed the smokers soft across the frames and saw the thinned colony still living, still hers, and when Jonah came up for the day's work she told him, steady, that she would take his name through the season and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him, she would learn, was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the valley's circuit preacher in the dooryard by the bee lot, with old Silas Boone and his wife Maud for witnesses and the wind off the hills for music. There was no ring and no kiss. Because that was not what this was, Jonah said the words low, looking at the hives, and Thea said hers looking out at the blackened orchard, waiting on a second bloom. That evening Thea slept in her own little house, a married woman, and Jonah slept on the lean to cot a married man, the brass smoker on the shelf in the honey shed in the dark, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that hungry spring into a thin summer was the slow making of them. The valley came on warm and dry and short of bloom, and there was nowhere much to be but at the work of keeping the colonies alive. And though Jonah kept faithfully to the lean-to and asked her for nothing, a paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight whether two people will or no. He hauled water to the failing hives in the heat where no one had asked him to, mended the sagging honey-shed roof, and split a winter's wood against a season he had promised only to stay a part of, all without a word. And she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, the language of mended and tended things, and began, without quite deciding to do for him in return, kept a plate warm for whatever hour he came down off the ladders, washed the sap and dust from his one good shirt last and best, and learned the sound of his step in the dooryard. And the talk, between two people who had married to stop talk, came slow, and then easier, the way a hive warms when the sun comes round to it. She found he was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to. And if she went on with the bees and did not press him, the words came on their own, low at the edge of the lamplight, dry and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her, a piece at a time, about the wife he had lost and the orchard he had meant to plant her and never did, and Thea did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. They did not name what was happening, but the hard, lonely lot had stopped being a place she merely endured, and they both felt the change and were afraid of it, because a thing built to last one season has no business taking root. It was the old brass smoker that opened the way through. One still warm night, with the bees gone quiet in the dark, Thea took the smoker down to clean the ash and oil the bellows, the way Daniel had taught her, and worked the domed lid free to clear the soot inside, and this time, under the little felt cap that seated up in the dome where the smoke cooled, she found a square of paper gone soft and brown at the creases, her own name on the front, in Daniel's careful hand. It was the unsteady hand of his last sick winter, and Thea understood that he had written it knowing the pleurisy might not let him go, and hidden it in the one thing he knew she would keep and one day take apart to care for, and never said a word. She sat down at the kitchen table in the warm lamplight and read it. Daniel had written that the great fear of his dying was not the dying, but the worry that his good, strong girl would take, keeping the bees and guarding his memory for the whole of what was left her, and would spend her life shut up, with the hives and her chin up and her heart closed, asking nothing of anybody because she had been taught too young to do without. The bees will hum for you and the work will keep you company, he had written, but a hive cannot put its arms around you, and I did not love you only to leave you a trade. And then, at the very last, in a line that must have cost the sick man the final of his strength, do not let your pride or their hard words keep you from being loved when the time comes. When a good soul sees the whole of you and does not look away, let him. That is the one thing I want for you still. Now I cannot give it to you myself. Live, Thea, be warm. She wept then, the way she had not let herself weep since the cold morning she lost him, alone at the table with her husband's last kindness open under the lamp. Daniel had not spent his dying breath asking her to keep his bees or guard his memory. He had spent it begging her to set the weight down and let herself be held, and naming, before he knew there would be one, the very kind of good soul who might one day come. The next morning, when Jonah came down stamping the dust off his boots, and she handed him his coffee, she let her hand rest against his on the warm tin cup a moment longer than she ever had, and did not pull away, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. Then the worst of the dry summer bore down on the valley, and with it the reckoning Thea had been bracing for, though it did not come the way she had feared. A second bloom came at last, late and sudden, the whole valley's fruit trees breaking white in a single warm week after the long dearth, the only chance the orchards would have to set a crop that hungry year, and it would last but a handful of days, and there was not a colony left in all that country to work it but hers. Thea read the thing before any of them. The bloom on every tree and her own thinned hives, the single thread the whole valley's fruit now hung upon, and the bee lot where she sat scorned the one place that could save the harvest. She nursed the failing colonies through that bloom with everything Daniel had taught her, fed them, gentled them with the brass smoker breathing soft over the frames. Carried frames between the weak hives and the strong to hold them all alive, and her bees rose into the bloom and worked it tree to tree across the valley, and the orchards set their fruit, every grafted tree and every old one. Because a lone woman the town called Unnatural had kept her head and kept her bees alive, and Jonah was with her in it. When the bloom broke, he had gone up and down the valley without being asked, carrying her weak hives in the cool of the dawn to the orchards that needed them worst, the two of them working the short, desperate bloom like a thing long practiced. And when it was over and the fruit was set, he came down off the last ladder and stood with her at the bee lot fence in the warm dusk. The orchards green and heavy behind them, and did not say anything at all, and did not need to. So when the quarter day came on, and Orrin Vesper rode out to finish the business, a notice in his hand, meaning to call the lease void and clear the ground now the hives were as good as dead, he found he had walked into the wrong valley. He had not been there the week of the bloom. He did not know what the summer had made. He stood at the gate and began on the notice in his smooth, sorry voice, and before he was well started the people began to come. Up from the orchards all along the valley, the farmers whose trees had set their first fruit in 2 years, and knew now exactly whose bees had done it. And they made it immovably plain that the merchant was clearing no lot and putting nobody off any ground. And Jonah Reed had a thing of his own to say. He came and stood at the gate beside her and told the merchant, in more words than the valley had ever heard him string together, that there was not an orchard in the whole country that would have set a crop this year without these hives and this woman's hands, and that there was no honest reason left to call the lot dead or put off the only soul who had kept the valley in fruit. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply stood for their own, and the merchant, who had come to clear a lone widow off the ground he wanted, found himself answered instead. The green orchards heavy at his back, the week of the bloom on every tongue, a whole valley of plain witnesses between him and the woman he had come to unseat. Orrin Vesper tried once or twice at the smooth words that had always served him, found there was no room left at that gate for them, and rode back to town. The town found it had no wish to clear a bee lot that kept every orchard in the country bearing, and the notice was burned, and Thea Sorrell kept her hives. Jonah Reed had stood at the back of that crowd with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he crossed the dusty yard to stand at Thea's side where the whole valley could see him do it, the first time he had ever put himself plainly beside her before anyone. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said low, but not so low that the nearest could not hear, that he had told her in the spring he would set her free in the fall, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to be free of her, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any paper got up against a merchant, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Thea Sorrell, who had made her peace with quiet hives and being of use to people who would not say her name, looked at the silent man who had seen the whole of her through a long, hard season and never once looked away, heard her husband's last letter in her own ears, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early fall, for true this time, when the orchards hung heavy in gold and the honey flow had come back strong, and the supers filled at last with the first good crop in 2 years. They stood up together in the little valley church that had drawn its skirts past her only a season before, with old Silas and Maud Boone, and half the valley crowded into the back in their good clothes, and a few of the respectable wives near the front looking a shade ashamed of themselves, as well they might. The circuit preacher who had married them in the dooryard said the words right at last. The fall light coming gold through the glass, and that bright morning, when the work was done and the bees were drowsing in the warm, Thea took up the old brass smoker out of long habit and breathed it once, soft, across the nearest open hive, just for herself, the low contented note the colony had given Daniel and given her through every season. Because the worn brass thing that had been the one sound of home through every lonely month had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come to the valley an orchardman's wife and been left a widow with a strange trade and a stolen name. Certain the best of her life lay buried on the rise above the bee lot with Daniel. She grew old on that lot that became a true bee farm when the seasons turned good again, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would, and in time the few rented hives gave way to long white rows of her own. The honey of that valley went out under her name, and the wives who had once drawn their skirts past her brought their jars to her door at harvest, and were glad of her. The old brass smoker hung on its peg in the honey shed by then, worn smoother than ever, beside a newer one the trade had brought, waiting for the young woman come to learn the bees at the famous keeper's elbow, and on the last evening of this story the two of them caught the low gold light through the shed door, the old worn one and the new. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend, before the lamp burns low. When the world has hung a name on you that you did not earn, do you let your pride and their hard words keep you small and alone? Or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the green one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.